What's it going to take to get this old Suzuki Fury back in action and on the racetrack? It's only been sitting on a shelf for an unknown amount of years. Boy, talk about a long stint in Project Purgatory. That one is it. So on today's episode of How Many Parts Can We Replace Twice Because, well, probably forgot what we did the first time around. We'll see if we can't get this thing to make a pass down the drag strip. Now you might have seen this before. There was a whole process of trying to get this thing back up and running, and did a ton of work to it, redid a bunch of stuff, replaced parts. In the end, basically failed at making it run and drive and do what it was supposed to. As with a lot of projects, it just got put into storage. We'll get to it next year. Well, next year comes and goes, and it ends up still sitting. But it wasn't forgotten, and I take pride in the fact that even though some projects sit around for years, there is a chance that they'll get brought back into the shop and get another chance. As you can tell, this thing was set up in a premium storage facility, did all the proper summarizing and long-term storage things to it, and the motor is, well, apparently the hood's not connected. Now this was running before, but the nail in the coffin as to why it ended up getting laid up was that it just wouldn't run at low RPMs. It felt like the ignition system wasn't working. It would just constantly bog and have no power until you hit a certain threshold in RPM, and then it was like both cylinders kicked in the full bore and it would go as long as you kept the RPMs up. As soon as you let it drop below that certain level, boom, it would just fall on its face. Now I swear that the jetting was gone through I don't know how many times, checked everything there and could not find a problem. So I'm pretty sure that the actual ignition components specifically for this motor are almost impossible to find. So we're going to have to come up with a plan B. Also going to end up going through and having to clean all the corrosion and possible mouse nests out of stuff. At least the mud bees have been hard at work. That'll help get those pipes up to temperature quicker. Yeah, the old bungee cord gave up the ghost. Might actually have to secure that tank down. Definitely forgot how rough this thing is. If there was ever a barn fresh sled, that's kind of it. All those parts at one time were cleaned up. They've just gotten corroded and dusty and all kinds of cobwebs built up. Now luckily the tank, that seemed to hold up pretty well. We'll dump that old gas in the truck. I'm pretty sure that those cracks were already in the track when it was installed. Oh yeah, that'll help bring down those ETs. Might take a pass with the shop vac just so that dirt doesn't go straight into the cylinders. I think there was a mouse nest down in there. So instead of nitrous injection, we got mice piss injection. Gonna clean up them clutches. Probably see if we can get some debris out of the carburetors. Maybe add an extra ground strap from the motor over to where the CDI is mounted. Doesn't hurt to always do that. Can't remember if that was done or not. Then we'll just pick up where we left off and see how the spark is. So pulled the plugs out, and it's got spark, but you got to spin the motor fairly quick to get spark. Now I ran an extra dedicated ground from the motor over to where the CDI is mounted. Didn't seem to make a difference at all. Also unplugged the key switch, no change there. Drained out the old rancid gas. Gonna put some fresh stuff in and just see if we can't crank it up. Alright, well we put some fresh fuel in it. Guess we'll see if it runs. we didn't fix the problem, we just sort of hacked it back together enough to hopefully make it work. Just gotta be easy on the choke when you use it. It's enough aerobics for now. So I think we've successfully determined that the problem still exists. Just digging through the stack of manuals, I was able to find this sucker. Alright, well, we was actually running the multimeter, trying to find continuity between some of the grounds and the stator plate. And it was found that between any part of the grounding up here at the coil to the engine case was 25 ohms, which it should be approaching 0, but 25 just seemed to be too much. So we pulled the stator, and that ground right there in the middle, redid it, and the resistance went down to about 5 ohms. So we're going to put it all back together and see if that wasn't the cause of all this trouble. So while the old flywheel's out, there's a whole lot of dirt that was built up. Might as well blow that out. So redid the grounds, went back in there, pulled the motor over, and the spark was still weak like it was before. Now I almost went and just put the pipes back on and tried to fire it up again just to see if something maybe changed. But actually trusted the readings on the gauge here. You're supposed to get 400 ohms of resistance for the low speed coil, which when you do that, we continued to get nothing. No continuity at all. So basically that was reconfirming suspicions that the low speed coil is where the problem's at. So I had to pull the recoil, pull the flywheel off again, all that, and well, got to try to not drop it. But we got the stator out, and I don't think a coil should be free floating like that. Yeah, so it looks like as that coil was bouncing around, probably broke the wire somewhere in there, and that's why we don't have any continuity. So I actually pulled this wire up through the middle there. That's what's supposed to connect. And as you can see, it was actually burning down in there as it was coming apart, probably from all that shaking. Eventually it just wore through the connector or bent it enough times that it broke, and well, that was it for the low speed coil. Now I happen to have some miscellaneous junk motors laying around. I tore this one apart, and unfortunately they've got a much wider primary coil. Well, wrong one, that one there, compared to the two little thin ones. Not quite an exact swap. I'm gonna have to go do some part shopping. So right now it's dark, but we're gonna start rummaging through the randoms pile to see if there's a coil or a CDI or any miscellaneous parts that could possibly swap over onto that ignition. Ooh. Well, there's just a whole pile of stuff. Oh, man, I forgot. I got all this stuff out in heydays. Whoa. Oh, skidoo. Well, there's got to be something in there. Man, we're even going through my own personal sell pile for the swap meet, for the dollar box. I can't find a Suzuki coil. Well, there's one on an engine, but I know I've seen one floating around. We've now reached the last resort of parts. Dang. Must have sold it. That's why you never sell anything. Well, we're only a few days away from the next race, and of course this thing's not even running yet for any testing. Still getting that electronic ignition figured out. Wish this thing just had points. But a good substitution for tuning is thinking about tuning. So down there at the tunnel, there's some rust holes, and normally I just consider that weight savings, but it's in a pretty close proximity to the carburetor. Don't need to be throwing all that dirt straight up into the cylinders. This should work. It's even the right color. Well, even the frame might be getting thin down there. Good thing this stuff's structural. Well, we're back on the hunt for a motor. Parts motor, Jag motor to be specific. And just kind of cruising through the miscellaneous pile here. I swear there was a Jag motor somewhere in here. And bam! There it is. But it's missing the stator. Kind of got motor Jenga going here, but as long as they're stable, I don't want to disturb the pile. You know, the really sad part is I had a couple of Jag motors torn apart and the stators out of them. I think I ended up selling them. Probably really cheap too. And now I need it. When you ever gonna learn? Dude, did we really just find a spare CDI box for a Fury? Well, we got multiple wrong potential ones here. There's options. Something's got to work. Probably ought to match the spacing of the mounting screws. And that one doesn't fit. The cat ones, close, but not quite. Things are quickly getting into a technical world of electronics. I don't particularly like it. So we grabbed these coils out of an old chaparral stator because they look like they might fit with depth-wise stacking up there. However, after getting them apart, I measured the resistance across them. The low-speed one is about 260 ohms, and the high-speed's 25. Now, at first kind of thought, well, that's close enough. The original coils are supposed to be 400 on the low speed and 1.5 on the high speed. Fairly significant difference. I did some looking online, and I think that there is a sort of equivalent old Suzuki setup that looks identical anyways from the pictures that should bolt onto here. Now, whether or not the resistances will be right, we'll find out when we get the thing in the mail. But I think having the too high of a resistance on the one's either going to give it too much or too little power on the top end. And I have a decent feeling that might end up popping that CDI. So, last resort may be just throwing this in there and seeing if it works. But might try and save that CDI box and actually put the right part in it for now. We do need maximum performance here. Yeah, this is definitely a one-year wonder ignition system. It's got the pickup coil set up down here. And you can actually see on the magnet cutaway, it has this crazy flywheel that has little sections of magnet that sort of extend through in different parts. And those are there just to trigger that pickup coil. Almost all of the newer type coils just use the magnetic switching field on the coil itself as the timing to trigger, and you can just move the whole stator to set the timing. Or there may be some other external thing on the outside of the flywheel. The manual actually shows a pretty cool graph here on where the low side coil and the high side coil sort of pick up for one another, and you end up with an average power supply for the CDI. Now this is interesting because it might be possible to use a different set of low and high side coils for this, being that on this particular one the high side is a very low resistance coil and the low side is a really high resistance coil. In the newer ones they all seem to have gotten a lot closer, maybe 25 on this one and like 175 or so on the other, somewhere in that range. I mean, being that the engine was almost running only on this coil alone, it wouldn't take a whole lot of extra power to just get this thing to actually run. On the other hand, I'm not sure what that supply voltage output is actually supposed to be for this thing. If you go too high, might just burn out the CDI. Well, ran into difficulties trying to swap over the chaparral coils. The holes were in a different spot, and you'd had to do quite a bit of modification to get the flywheel to actually line up on there because they put them just way too far in. So, was able to source a similar looking part, aftermarket of course, that have the right size and shape coils that actually bolt on there, and they should not interfere with the flywheel. Problem is, there's more wires than was originally on here, and none of them are grounded to the coil like this one sort of is. So I don't know what to do with these extra wires. At this point, we may just end up ripping apart this two-piece coil, using the new low speed and going with the old high speed in place of it. Now, the resistance on the low speed coil is also not the same as it should be, but you know what, 172 is better than 0. Well, did a little bit more thinking here before we completely start tearing things apart. There's 2 wires coming out of each of those, and there's no continuity from the wire to the center of the coil. However, the old one had another wire coming out, but it was immediately soldered onto it right there. So I'm not sure if it matters which side. We get a 50-50 shot. If we end up grounding one of these back to there, we should end up with the 3 wires coming out like we had on the originals. Got to reuse the shorter spacers here. Ones that came with the coil are too long. So there is the finished product. Grounded the gray wire, ran all the others the way they were. When you run the resistances, you get 1.5 on this one and 172 on the lower one. Well, the stator is in there. The flywheel moves without making any weird grinding noises. I guess this is the last shot to see if the thing's going to go to the races this weekend. Not quite sure where all the charging wires go. Alright, everything's back together. See if we got any spark. There it is. Of course, there was spark before, but maybe it's just my brain, but I think that's a better spark this time. Alright. I don't know what test this is, but we're going to try and fire it up again. It was running not that long ago, but it wasn't running well. Wow, that seems all too familiar. It's like so close. I don't know, we're going to cheat a little bit, I guess. take the belt off. Maybe there's just too much drag. Or we'll just loosen the belt up inside like that. Well, it's like the world's slowest motor. Took the spark plugs and gapped them down like 15 thousandths. Didn't make a difference. We're going to go get some brand new V-series plugs and maybe some non-resistor caps. I'm not sure what else we're going to try after that. Been saving the good ones for the race sled. Kind of pains me to actually use them. I think these spark plugs are worth more than the sled. I think this is about it for now, because if this doesn't work, I'm going to have to just start ripping apart even more stators trying to find a low-speed primary coil that's around 400 ohms. Good luck with that. Well, we just swapped out the CDIs and it's doing the exact same thing. So it's got to be that lower resistance, low speed coil. Huh. After all that work, back to square one again. Need to go to the parts shelf here and, well, we might actually need to work on this thing. I was half joking about just rebuilding this coil here, but that might actually be what has to happen. So now the trick is going to be find what gauge wire that's supposed to be, roughly estimate how many feet of wire get wound to get the 400 ohms resistance. Looks like there was some protective material on there to keep the wires from chafing. It didn't do a very good job apparently. So we'll wrap it up in something, maybe duct tape, throw it into the drill, spin it a bunch, throw some wire on there, see what happens. So we're trying to measure the diameter of these wires, and they're thin. About 7 thou is what we're coming out to. Now the original coil wires, they just took that tiny wire and wrapped it around a larger wire and then soldered it. That's a pretty good way of doing it. Alright, we got some speaker magnet wire, fresh off the boat from China. So wrapped some wire insulation around the coil, covered it in some epoxy, and then pressurized it with electrical tape. We'll see if it comes out. You got to insulate the steel portion from the copper coil of wire, I believe. I mean, I'm sure everybody's going to tell me how I'm doing this wrong, but I don't know how to rewind a stator. Well, since everything was epoxied together and it got sawed in half, you kind of need these end caps to contain all the wire when you're winding it. So we took an old chip dip container and made up some plastic things that will epoxy onto the ends. Yeah, something like that. Got a copper electrical lug, drilled a hole through it, put part of a bolt in there, and drilled a hole there for a cotter, hose clamp. Good to go. I've been watching those videos of the guys over in Pakistan that rebuild truck axles and alternators with nothing but a hammer and some worn out tools in the dirt. That's the level of sophistication that we're going for on this build. Now this is supposed to be 4 ounces of wire, but when you put it on the scale, it is almost exactly 4 ounces with the spool. I'll have to take a guess at how much that spool weighs, and then basically figure out the length of wire needed compared to the weight used. There's some formulas online that show length versus resistance. Drilled a hole and ran the wires down into there, and we got the thin one we're going to solder and then pull that back up and epoxy that into place. Yeah, you got to sand off some of that insulating coating there before you can solder the wires. Just tried scraping it with the knife. It didn't work out too well. Well, this is definitely taking some time. So according to calculations, 3 ounces of wire is what we want left on the or off of the spool onto the coil, and gotta get this thing set back to ounces. So we've successfully put 1 ounce on there. Alright, so it's at the projected weight of wire. Now what I ended up doing was taking the resistance from that wire, and there's a little piece down there I was able to sand off the coating and run the meter on it. 550 ohms for the entire thing. So that's quite a bit over the 400 that's the target. So I think we have plenty of wire. If we have to, we'll unwind some to get it down to 400 ohms. So sanded a spot on the wire. A few more feet to go. We're going to call that close enough. Wasted a little bit of wire, but better to have too much on there. You can't add it once you cut it. Picked up some varnish and working on getting some of that fiberglass insulation there bonded onto her. Whew, does that stuff smell? So plan was going to be to replace the larger coil with the freshly rebuilt one. However, was trying to pull this blue wire off, thought it was just epoxied to the side of this coil, but there's a piece of solder in there, and there's some more junctions going on, which I really don't know what's happening with this coil. There's more wires than the old one had. So just dug the original high-speed ignition coil out of the pile, and we're going to put it back together with the rebuilt one. Got it stacked back together, giving it the final ohms. I mean, close to 400. Go across the high speed. That's supposed to be like 1.5, but I'm not getting a good connection and the scale's wrong. But you get the idea. Got to button up a few more loose wires here. Maybe some more zip ties. And then for the 18th time, I'm going to put the stator back in and see what happens. Alright, this thing's going in, hopefully for the last time. Going to try one more time. See what the spark looks like. What? Oh, might help if I plug the CDI in. Try this again. Oh. I saw a good spark once. Alright, not even going to wire wrap that stuff unless this thing runs. Moment of truth. This thing's either going to run or it's going to the scrap pile. Well, probably just storage. But they're one and the same around here. Maybe we'll give it some half choke. That's starting off dismal. Really? Alright, well, we wired in the old CDI, which seemed to work before, but just as bad. I mean, we were really scraping by here. We're to the point that I've got to watch the video to see what the heck I did to this thing before.
That's right.
So an interesting detail is down on the motor is a white ignition coil. Now I kind of remember this. I think I might have tried swapping out ignition coils first to try and get that ignition fixed.
Now, upon current inspection, we got a black coil in there. So that ain't factory.
So if that ends up being the problem and that old replacement part coil would have worked inside the stator instead of rewinding, well, I'm going to be, well, fit to be tied. So once again, we're scrounging through the parts pile, and I first thought, well, there's a silver coil, but that's actually just paint. It is white underneath. All right, well, we went black, but we're going back to the original. Cross-checked some numbers, and that appears to be the factory coil. Might try to scrape some of that performance paint off of there so that it actually has a ground. Now maybe it's just wishful thinking, but the way that thing was running, it was like it would build up a charge, discharge some spark, and then cut out for a while. Well, it built up again, and then bam, it would have spark again. All the different things we did with the ignition coils, changed the CDI, none of that seemed to help. It was constantly having that issue. Well, that would definitely explain it if it's the wrong coil that's taking too much energy to charge up before it can discharge. That was something that, again, you try to fix one problem. If you don't keep track of the changes you make, you end up chasing your tail again. Fingers crossed, this was part of the problem. Not to say that a completely non-functioning, low-speed primary coil wasn't hurting performance. Well, the coil's not mounted 100% correctly, but whatever. It's good enough for spark check. Of course, the recoil is not really recoiling. Well, that sort of sparked. Alright, this is the last time. This is getting progressively worse. Let's choke the heck out of it. Choke the life out of it. Well, this might become a parts machine. So I have been beyond frustrated with this thing. It just seems no matter what you do, it just does not want to run. And went through that coil. We know that one coil ignition, the primary coil was bad. Changed that. Still has the right resistance. I threw a new recoil on here because it was too dark to throw this thing up into the rafters, and I gave it one more pull. And it did its sputtering thing. Disconnected all of the wires, including the one that's the kill switch circuit right there. And I even grounded it out completely onto the case there with a set of vice grips. So, doing that, it's stone dead. It won't even pop. However, when you take this thing off for the first time and give it a yank, it almost seemed to run better for that split second after the kill switch had become disengaged. So I reached down here, noticed that the thing was just barely touching on the metal. Well, moved it out of the way, see if we can't fire it up again. If I can get it to run, I'll show you something. So, I was getting some shocks there. That thing starts throwing the arcs, and all of a sudden it starts running. If you touch it completely, it shuts it off completely. What the heck's that about? So we're back to the diagram. And I don't quite speak electronics fluently yet. So there's like diodes, resistors, and something funky going on to the outputs of them coils and the kill switch. Well, we're reaching new lows, going and finding computers that are sitting in the scrap pile trying to salvage a diode. There's got to be a diode in here somewhere. Oh yeah, pay dirt. I think we found one. Bet you didn't think a discarded motherboard was going to come into play on this build. Alright, so this thing is basically a one-way valve for electrons. So I'm assuming it's only going to work one way. We'll get a 50-50 shot of finding out. So in an effort to not lose that tiny little diode, I soldered it to a couple of wires and a couple of connectors here. It's female on both sides, so we can kind of switch it around if we don't have the direction right. So we got it looped from the kill wire back to the ground. This is the 8th final time we're trying this. No kill switch. Alright, it's got to be backwards. We'll swap the wires around. Maybe it needs some choke. Well, that's just working awesome. Unhooked it now. I'm out of ideas. But if this thing wants just a little bit of resistance when you're touching the ground, well, a little bit of resistance it'll get. 1,000 ohms? Sure. Tried all the different sorts of resistors in there. Nothing would work. Tried it in combinations with the diode. The only way you could get it to rev up is just keep tapping that ground, and it would spark like crazy. And if your elbow was touching the brake rotor, you'd get sparked like crazy. But you'd have to tap it on and off, and it would rev up and start running. It wouldn't quite rev out. It was still running out of ignition. It seemed like it would pop out the carbs and backfire a little bit. But that was it. That was the only way you could get it to sort of rev out and come to life, is on and off tapping of that ground. Grass drag season ends here in another couple of days, and one more season if this thing didn't get the run. This project is ending up basically where it started. Scratching my head trying to figure out what in the heck is causing this thing to not run correctly. Checked the resistances on this trigger coil. It looked good. It seems to be working. Who knows? Maybe that's something else to look into. Kind of running out of ideas. At this point, I'm going to look into anything. Was really trying to just stick it out and use the existing system. Worst case scenario might be taking and changing the entire bottom end of the motor to try and use a more modern, commonly available ignition system. But that would kind of take away from the actual heart and soul of the Fury, which is that 1 year only motor. So even though this whole endeavor seemed to fail for now, definitely got a lot more useful knowledge about electronics and sort of trying to hack stuff together. I was really going to be excited if this thing actually worked.